I approach the issue of remembering the Civil War with one basic principle. And that basic principle is that historians have looked at the Civil War and its aftermath as really a morality play. That is, the North is the republic of virtue, and the South is the evil empire. Well, we all know that history is much more complicated than that. And what I'd like to do this morning, I would like to add to those complications in how we remembered that war. And the memory of that war is not only how Southerners, white and black, remembered that war, but also how Americans generally remembered that war. And we'll see some remarkable parallels in that memory. So let us begin. And by the way, if at any time, I don't have a prepared text or anything, so if at any time during the presentation you have a question, just shoot up your hand or shout out, and I will be happy to stop and try to respond to it. The Civil War killed 750,000 young men. This young man's a Confederate soldier who died at Petersburg on April 1st, 1865, as Grant was going to take Richmond. The U.S. has fought a lot of wars, except for World War II. All of those wars have been wars of choice, not of necessity, and the Civil War was a war of choice. And when so many young men died, think of it this way. If we were to extrapolate the number of deaths in the Civil War to today in per capita population, you'd have a death rate of 10 million young men. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. So one thing to keep in mind about this war is that it caused a great deal of heartache, heartbreak, death, destruction. That's what wars do. We seem to have a knack as a nation of jumping into conflicts, not understanding that our participation can have serious and often unintended consequences. And let's take a look at some of those consequences of the Civil War. This is the homecoming of a Union soldier. You can see he's slightly wounded, but there's a sense of warmth in this picture. His family is gathered around and around the hearth, and they're all happy to see him. Perhaps several generations of the family.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have a breakdown on what percentage of the deaths were battlefield deaths and what were...
The majority were not battlefield deaths.
Yes.
Yeah. The majority of soldiers died from diseases, germs that were not identified at that time in hospitals. There were more people dying in hospitals than on the battlefield. But still, they would not have been in those hospitals had there been no war. I'm going to try this. There we go. And this is a Southern homecoming. You can see this Confederate soldier, and you can see what he comes home to. Yeah, it's sort of a broad dichotomy, but it gives you some idea because about 90% of the war was fought in the South, and the South experienced the greatest destruction of property, in addition, of course, to its soldiers. One of the issues after the war in the South was, of course, what to do with 4 million freed slaves. You can't re-enslave them, that's for sure. But at the same time, there was a great fear that suddenly 4 million slaves would not work, or they would go on a rampage, or they would all go to the cities and create chaos. So it was incumbent upon white Southerners to try to control their black population. Now, keep in mind that white Southerners lost the war. And white Southerners believed that God was on their side. How could God have abandoned them? Well, they must have done something to anger God. So what they dedicated themselves to was restoring as much as possible the civilization of the old South, so they could live a pure, simple, and faithful life to do honor to God. And the cornerstone of that old South civilization was white supremacy. And so, in the decades after the Civil War, the major task of white Southerners was to restore and maintain white supremacy. And you see this drawing, the caption, which you can't see, is at the bottom. It says, whipping a Negro girl in North Carolina. And you can see that. You can see this is a lynching, right? Where did this lynching take place? Anybody know? This is New York. And here, again, this is my point. White supremacy was not a Southern concoction. White supremacy was an American construction, North and South. This was part of the draft riots in July 1863. 6 black men were hanged in New York City, and a good deal of black property was destroyed. The repository for white supremacy was in one of the national parties, the Democratic Party. Of course, Lincoln was a Republican, as we all know. And in 1868, and this is after the Civil War, in 1868, Horatio Seymour of New York ran for president on the Democratic ticket, and this was his theme song. You know, every campaign has a theme song. Bruce Springsteen wasn't around then, so this. And the theme song was The White Man's Banner. Again, the idea that the Democratic Party is the party of white men. It's a national party. So it's appealing not only to folks in the South, but particularly to voters in the North. Part of the campaign to delegitimize Reconstruction, to delegitimize the franchise for African Americans, part of the campaign was a national effort to ridicule the black governments or African American politicians in the South. And this is a depiction by the famous Harper's cartoonist, Thomas Nast, a German immigrant. And Harper's, by the way, was published in New York. It was a national publication. It was not a Southern publication. In fact, it circulated very little in the South because of its strong Republican connection. So it was not only the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party took up this theme. Now, why do you suppose the Republican Party would try to make fun of or ridicule African American voting? Because Northerners had their own problems with a minority whom they felt was not ready for voting political participation. And these, of course, were immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants. And so you get this Thomas Nast cartoon. And the caption on this one, which you can't see, the caption on this one is "The Ignorant Vote." In a perfect world, Thomas Nast was saying, these two folks would not be allowed to vote. In the South, the black voter, and in the North, the white voter, but a particular white voter. Thomas Nast always drew the Irish as monkeys. In other words, he racialized the Irish. And the idea was that these folks are not ready for democracy. And during this time, this was 1876, during this time, white Southerners were trying to limit as much as they could through violence, the Ku Klux Klan, and through legal means to limit the vote of African Americans. And there grew up a movement in the North, too, to do the same to immigrants, particularly Roman Catholic immigrants, because the idea was that Roman Catholic immigrants owed their allegiance to the Pope in Rome, not to the President of the United States, and besides, priests will tell them how to vote. They do not have a mind of their own. Now, while this was going on in Reconstruction, most Northerners did not pay much attention to what was happening in the South. They really didn't care. They were not interested in these periodic flare-ups of violence against African Americans. They were not interested in how the Southern former Confederates were reinstituting white supremacy, were reinstituting forms of slavery. They were mainly interested in making money. The Civil War opened up a cornucopia of economic opportunities. Two major industries burst forth from the Civil War that had not existed prior to the Civil War, and these two industries were the oil industry and the steel industry, and generated huge amounts of profits. And New York City became the entrepot of America, and one of the largest ports in the world. And here you see lower Manhattan. There's steel mills. These are the Carnegie steel mills. I always like to point out the Carnegie steel mills because when my grandfather came to the U.S., he worked in the Carnegie steel mills in Pittsburgh. Maybe you can see him in this slide. But so the new industries drew literally millions of new immigrants. And they weren't Northern European Protestants. They were Southern and Eastern European Catholics and Jews. In fact, Northerners had a word for Italian immigrants. They weren't called Italian. They were never called Italians. They were called Guineas. Where is Guinea? It's in Africa. How many Italians live in Guinea? 0. So again, the idea of racializing, of reducing immigrant groups or despised immigrant groups into the same category as black people. Now, at the same time, with the growth of industry in the North, you begin to have labor troubles. And Northerners are concerned about this because many of the agitators were, in fact, immigrants. And Northerners began to look longingly longingly at the South. The North was becoming urbanized and industrialized, and the home of a wide diversity of people. Whereas the South now, after Reconstruction, was a calm and placid place, a place where old school values flourished, where people got along, sat on the porch, and drank sweet tea, and looked out on the fields. It was a beautiful scene. And so, beginning in the 1880s and continuing on into the early decades of the 20th century, Northerners and Southerners came together to remember the Civil War. And what they remembered, and here's the 50th anniversary gathering at Gettysburg in 1913, the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. See Confederate and Union veterans. What they remembered about the war was that both sides fought heroically, but the North won, the South attributed to superior numbers and materiel, and the North attributed to the fact that they were just better people. But there was a reconciliation, which is great, I think, because when you fight a war, that's what you hope for at the end. That eventually, not immediately, of course, but eventually the two adversaries would become reconciled. I mean, look at the U.S. today. Two of our strongest allies are Germany and Japan. Yet 70 years ago, we were fighting them as hard as we could. So from the point of view of reconciliation, this is a good thing. But along with reconciliation went a mutual agreement. And that agreement was that African Americans were inferior, that certain immigrants were also inferior. And how these two soldiers remembered the peace after the war shaped public policy for decades. And here is a northern painter, came down to Natchez, Mississippi in 1883 to paint this bucolic scene. And you know, compare that to the sort of smoky steel mills and the bustle of New York. I mean, isn't this just a placid scene? And you can see here the cotton fields. And who's working the cotton fields? African Americans are working the cotton fields. If you had come to Natchez, Mississippi in 1853, 30 years earlier, you'd have seen the same thing. So the question I ask is, why did we fight a civil war? Why did we fight a civil war and kill 750,000 men if this is the result? I haven't gotten a good answer for that yet. Instead, we get this. We get the Moonlight and Magnolias view of the South. Now, it's interesting to note that the Moonlight and Magnolia view of the South was a Northern concoction. Northerners developed it because it was so antithetical to the chaos and turmoil and diversity that they were experiencing. The South looked like an American oasis. The South's greatest attribute was that it was not the North. And sort of a gauzy picture. And the South erected monuments to the war. Never, never has defeat been monumentalized so avidly and so vividly. This is the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. I got there before they lowered the flag. And in the courthouse square of many southern communities, you have the Confederate soldier standing there. The dominance of public space. That was the idea, to tell everybody we rule. We are the masters. For African Americans looking at this scene in front of the Capitol building, what does this say to African Americans? It says, you don't count, and we don't care. Because these are the symbols of white supremacy. And we can talk more about what the flag really stands for during the Q&A. So organizations grew up in the South, like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And one of the sponsors of the United Daughters of the Confederacy was the National Casket Company, kind of ironic, I guess. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy was instrumental in writing and publishing and disseminating textbooks of American history. And you can imagine the point of view that these textbooks would take. And here's one of them. This was a textbook actually from high school in the South around 1900. That was distributed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it says, Sunday afternoon on a southern plantation. Isn't that a bucolic scene? The mistress is sitting around reading to the docile slaves, reading a book. And that's one of the mildest scenes in that book. But in the meantime, another reality was occurring in the South. The South was not necessarily this bucolic, rural, gone with the wind region. The South was industrializing, particularly in a region called the Southern Piedmont, where we're in right now. And the Southern Piedmont became the center, the national center for the textile industry. And you can see here that by 1913, the center of the textile industry was the Southern Piedmont. There were still some spindles up north in New England, but by and large, it was concentrated in the Southern Piedmont of North and South Carolina. Industries like tobacco. I mean, North Carolina became the leading industrial state in the South. James B. Duke introduced, along with R.J. Reynolds, introduced cigarettes, and these are from the packages of cigarettes. The cigarette was something that women indulged in from time to time, so Duke wanted to make this a masculine habit, and what better than to package his cigarettes with alluring young women on them. The problem was, of course, that it took time to roll cigarettes, and what Duke did, he imported about 2,000 Russian Jewish immigrants who had been familiar with rolling cigarettes. He imported them to Durham to roll cigarettes for his tobacco company, and it was quite successful until R.J. Reynolds came across a young Virginian, 17-year-old Virginian named Jimmy Bonsack. And Jimmy Bonsack had developed this cigarette rolling machine, and R.J. Reynolds installed the machine in Winston and eventually competed very successfully with James B. Duke. Coca-Cola, another Southern industrial product. Coca-Cola actually was first developed in 1886 by a pharmacist, John Pemberton, in Atlanta. Drinking was very common in the South. Drinking alcohol was very common in the South. In fact, the South drank more alcohol per capita than any other region in the country after the war. I guess when you lose a war, you tend to want to Pemberton thought he'd make millions of dollars if he could find a cure for a hangover. Imagine if you can find a cure for a hangover. Wouldn't that be great? Okay. Well, he heard that cocoa syrup, caffeine, had some mitigating impact on hangovers. So he developed this formula. It didn't sell very well. It didn't work, for one thing, or work very little. So he sold his patent to Asa Candler. And of course, as they say, the rest is history. Candler added some sugar and added a secret ingredient called cocaine. So that really picked you up. In fact, cocaine was in Coca-Cola until 1920. So don't all run out to the vending machines now and get your hit of cocaine. The Baptist Church outlawed, Southern Baptist Convention outlawed Coca-Cola in 1905 because they claimed it was addictive. And they were right. It was addictive. Not to be, what was that?
They outlaw alcohol.
Yeah, they also outlawed alcohol, but that was about as successful as outlawing Coca-Cola. Not to be outdone, North Carolina came roaring back in 1904 with the discovery of Pepsi-Cola and the cocaine Pepsi-Cola. And the first Pepsi-Cola bottling plant in the world opened in Charlotte in 1904, although a pharmacist in New Bern actually concocted the recipe for Pepsi-Cola. Also at the same time, and belying the idea that African Americans were not suited for modern civilization or they had limits to their intelligence, along with the urbanization and industrialization of the southern Piedmont came the growth and development of a black middle class. And you can see this in Durham, you can see it in Raleigh, you can see it in Charlotte. But at the same time, and because of the rise of the black middle class, and because of the challenges to white supremacy, the first generation of white Southerners born after the Civil War could not take the fact that their racial views were being contradicted by the advance of African Americans. And so beginning in the 1890s, you had a serious increase in lynchings. However, again, this was not necessarily a Southern phenomenon, as we pointed out. Nationally, beginning in the 1890s, African Americans began to be caricatured in certain ways. Not necessarily inhuman, but certainly less than white people. Aunt Jemima and pancakes made out of St. Louis, and you can see the caricature, Mammy caricature, and the advertising copy. That's from the 1890s. How about cream of wheat? Maybe cream of wheat ain't got no vitamins. I don't know what them things is. If they's bugs, they ain't none in cream of wheat, but she's sure good to eat and cheap. Costs about 1 cent to a great big dish, rastus. And of course, again, this is a caricature of African Americans used to sell a national product. Again, this is not coming from the South. This is coming from New York copywriters. And the first film in America, 1896, by Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison did not invent the film, the movie, but he perfected it and eventually added sound to it in 1927. This was the first. You can go online and see. It's called. The film is called, surprisingly enough, Eating Watermelons. And who were eating watermelons? Now, Thomas Edison was from New Jersey, so again, this caricature. Would you give these guys the right to vote? Would you allow these guys to move into your neighborhood? Would you allow these guys to go to school with your white children? So what's happening here is that you're developing a construction of African Americans that is decidedly inferior and different from that of white Americans. And this culminates in 1915 with the epic classic, The Birth of a Nation, by D.W. Griffith, a 3-hour extravaganza that really transforms the film industry. He used numerous techniques never used before, but used since. And basically, what it is the Southern interpretation of the Civil War. But by 1915, the Southern interpretation of the Civil War became the national interpretation. How did that happen? Well, it happened because publishers in New York decided that, hey, the South is a great big market, and if we can convince the UDC people that we're okay with this interpretation of the Civil War and African Americans, then we can sell lots of books, lots of textbooks in the South. And this is the heroine, one of the heroines of Birth of a Nation, Mae Marsh. I fell in love with her when I first saw this movie. Isn't she beautiful? And the climactic scene of the movie, and I will tell you, you can become caught up in it very easily. It's a magnificent movie from a technical standpoint. Comes when Mae Marsh is picking flowers in the woods, and Gus, this is during Reconstruction, and Gus, who is black, and thinks that because now he's no longer a slave and now has an official position in the Reconstruction government, that he's just as good as a white man. And if he's just as good as a white man, then he's going to have a white woman, get a white woman. And the climactic scene is when Mae Marsh, as I said, is picking flowers in the woods. And she's totally oblivious to the fact that Gus is creeping up on her. And finally she sees him and is startled, and she starts running. And then the camera pans back. And what you see, what she couldn't see, was that she was running uphill toward a cliff. And one or two things are going to happen. Either she's going to throw herself off the cliff to protect her virtue, or she's going to get ravished by this black fiend. I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to see the movie itself. But you can see what happened to Gus. Just at this moment, the camera cuts to the Ku Klux Klan mounting up and trying to ride to rescue Mae Marsh. And they capture Gus. Now you can see here, Gus is not really a black man, is he? He's a white guy with black face. And D.W. Griffith, almost all of the black characters in Birth of a Nation were white, but they used blackface. Now, I show this picture. This is an NAACP boycott in Boston. in 1947. This Boston theater was showing Birth of a Nation. Now, Birth of a Nation premiered in 1915. There aren't many movies that have that long a life. But more people have seen Birth of a Nation than any other movie in history. Than any other movie. And of course, what happened here was that the NAACP was calling for a boycott of this movie. But you know, when you call for a boycott of a book or a movie, you know what happens? It becomes much more popular. So it was kind of counterproductive in that case. But Thomas Edison, back again in 1927, Thomas Edison developed the technology to put sound into pictures. And the first talking picture was Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And again, there's Al Jolson in blackface. One of the things you'll note in the 1920s is that vaudeville was very popular. Of course, movies still were very popular. But you'll see a lot of the immigrants, particularly Italian and Jewish immigrants, blackface. Why? Well, it was part of American culture. They wanted to be part of America, and this was a caricature that was very American. It dated back to the 1820s. So it's not unusual to see this Jewish immigrant, who had never been further south. He's from Washington, D.C., never been further south than Washington, D.C., just longing for his mammy from Alabama in blackface. And the following year in 1928, the high point of the Ku Klux Klan revival, and this is the Ku Klux Klan marching down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. Imagine how far they get today. Well, maybe. And you can see in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, the state with the largest Klan membership was not Alabama or North Carolina. It was Indiana. It was Indiana. And around this time, this is actually 1929, a year later, more monuments went up. Because in the 1920s, we had a flourishing of scientific racism, where the conventional scientific view became that there were numerous races around the world, 36 to be exact, and these races exhibited different capacities. There was a hierarchy of races. At the top, of course, were Anglo-Saxons. And in fact, if you went from Northern Europe to the tip of Africa, basically that was the hierarchy. Now, the Irish placed low, and by geography, they're in Northern Europe. So that was an anomaly in this racial hierarchy. But you can see this. This was in Charlotte, put up by the United Confederate Veterans at Charlotte in 1929. And it says, a state and city's tribute of love and grateful recognition of the services of the Confederate soldiers whose heroism in war and fidelity in peace have never been surpassed. Accepting the arbitrament of war, they preserve the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South. So again, a very strong racial and now ethnic connotation about the Civil War. Something, by the way, the Confederates themselves would never do. And also, beginning in 1930, on Stone Mountain in Georgia, a famous sculptor who sculpted Mount Rushmore that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, began his sculpting of the great leaders of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. But he never got fully paid, so he said goodbye, and so it remains unfinished. But I will tell you, and this is part of the idea of reconciliation, Not that we all would agree on the interpretation of the war. We can agree to disagree, but we can reconcile ourselves as human beings. In 1996, when Atlanta held the Olympics, some of you may remember that, the Olympics in Atlanta, the penultimate moment was the closing ceremony when the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, Stone Mountain, playing that famous American composer Ludwig van Beethoven's Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony. And at that moment, spotlights shone on Stone Mountain and superimposed on Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson was Martin Luther King Jr. So you had this incredible quartet. And I don't know if these three guys would appreciate that, or if but I think Martin would. But it was an attempt to show that, hey, you know, we're all Southerners, we're all part of the same past. Let's get past the past. Except Gone with the Wind. I said Birth of a Nation was number one. Gone with the Wind is number two. Scarlett O'Hara. It's interesting that Margaret Mitchell is a wonderful story in herself. Margaret Mitchell, the family that she focuses on at Tara, the plantation, the family is Irish Catholic. And she did that on purpose. She did that on purpose because at that time, in the 1850s, there was a political party called the American Party up north that wanted to bar Roman Catholics, that wanted to bar particularly Irish Roman Catholics from coming into the country. Can you imagine barring a particular religion from coming into America? Never happened today. Okay. But eventually, the stories, the myths of the Old South confront the reality of the present. And we cannot achieve equality and equity without coming to terms with that past. Because if we don't come to terms with that past, we will continue on the same journey toward division and inequality. And it took the civil rights movement to set not only the present straight, but also to push us to reconsider and reinterpret the past, to write African Americans back into Southern history, and to call out Southern whites not as great war heroes only, but also as the perpetrators of white supremacy, and not only white Southerners, but white Americans in general. And part of that reconciliation that really was forced upon us by African Americans, part of that reconciliation, you can now see all across the South in our historic sites. 20 years ago, you wouldn't have heard much about slaves in Monticello. You would hear about servants, but not necessarily slaves. Now, there's a whole tour devoted to the landscape of slavery in Thomas Jefferson's home. Mississippi lawmakers approved legislation to construct Civil Rights Museum, which will open in 2018. Can you imagine Mississippi, the state legislature of Mississippi, spending money on a civil rights museum? Isn't that wonderful? I don't know what'll be in it, but the idea that we can use the past to reconcile the present. That's the idea behind it. Now, this is very controversial. I don't know about how you all think about this, but this is Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg. Obviously, slavery existed in colonial Williamsburg. And if you go to colonial Williamsburg, you will find scenes like this. This young black man is tilling the soil. As you know, many of the people walking around Williamsburg are in period costumes, and they talk and perform accordingly. And it was controversial because he's obviously a slave. Should we be depicting slavery? Personally, I think this is a good idea because it's reality. Because if you keep reality under the rug, it'll just fester there, and in its place will become fake news. There are still those who insist on promoting the lost cause. And I think the lost cause, Confederate battle flags, monuments, these items do have a place in our Southern history. But mostly they should be in a museum in the proper context. If you go to Berlin, and I want to say, I'm not saying that the Confederacy was any way comparable to the Third Reich, but if you go to Berlin, for example, and go to the German Historical Museum there, you'll see all sorts of Nazi paraphernalia and all sorts of things about Hitler and the Nazi Party. That's where it belongs. You can't bury history, but you can learn from it, and it should be visible to the public, just not in a public place. And here we have in Selma, Alabama, of all places, a bust to Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the original Ku Klux Klan. What to do with that, about it? And this is a continuing controversy in the South. We have lots of monuments, lots of commemorative sites that glorify the Confederate States of America. What do we do about them? I think Richmond had a great solution to this. Monument Avenue in Richmond, the site for all these Civil War monuments, including the equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee. They placed Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue, the African-American tennis star, thereby integrating Monument Avenue. I think that's a great way to do it, because you're not going to take Lee off his horse and put him in some museum. Have it out there and displayed, but make the statement that this public space is for all Richmonders, it's for all Virginians, not only for white Virginians. And the Lorraine Motel, black heritage tourism, at least as of 2015, black heritage tourism is a $3 billion industry now. So the fact that Mississippi wants to build this Civil Rights Museum is wonderful, but they're also thinking about a return. Now, fast forward to the present. In the South, it's always been a story of black and white. The South experienced very little immigration after 1900. Less than 2% of the 20 million immigrants who came between 1890 and the 1920s went to the South. So it really wasn't much of a factor. But that's changing now. North Carolina is one of the fastest growing states in the country in terms of immigrant population. the last census, which was 2010. And you can see particularly in the Piedmont region, those blotches of red. These are places where the Hispanic population is growing very rapidly. Not only the Hispanic population, but also now the Asian population. So what's happening is that instead of the South being a story of black and white, it's becoming a story of Technicolor. And it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the future. And speaking about the future, this is a daycare in Houston, Texas. Houston is the most diverse city in America. And you can see from this daycare, this is just a middle-class daycare in a middle-class neighborhood of Houston, and you can see just the diversity there among the children. This is the future of the South. The past of the South, we still need to deal with, but we are dealing with it in the appropriate way, in several ways. We're dealing with it by placing the memorabilia of the Confederacy in its appropriate context. We're dealing with it by telling the story of African Americans who are Southerners too, and we're dealing with it by moving on to frame a new South that will be inclusive not only of different races, but of different ethnic groups as well. Thank you all very much. I will be happy to answer any questions. I just went through 150 years of American history and obviously left a few things out, but yes, sir.
You know, after Bill and Ruth shot at that church in Charleston, there was a big conversation about these monuments and their place in our culture. In a state like North Carolina, we actually make it more difficult now for local localities to remove these monuments. If you go to our Capitol, you have like Andrew Johnson sitting there as a defender of the U.S. Constitution, which for people of color, you know, would be highly offensive. So how do you deal with that, though, when if we are going to try to get, you know, this reconciliation that happened 100 years ago, but we still are stuck there, where certain people encounter this history so differently and find what fits there?
From a logistical standpoint, it's very difficult to move large monuments. There are several ways you can deal with it. University of Texas dealt with it in one way. They have a statue of Robert E. Lee, and next to that, they erected a statue of Martin Luther King, Jr. And it's the same as in Monument Avenue. You put Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue. The less expensive way to deal with it is to put a commemorative plaque there, placing the monument in, or memorial, whatever it is, in context. Those are the ways you deal with it. It's just from a logistical standpoint to move these big things. It's going to be very expensive, and these days cities and states are not going to want to do it. But it is certainly appropriate to put these things in context. The difficulty is that our current legislature is taking increasing autonomy away from cities and removing it to the legislature so that cities and towns cannot do what is essentially the right thing.
Are they all worth keeping?
Well, they're part of our history. I mean, from an aesthetic standpoint, the question was, are they all worth keeping? From an aesthetic standpoint, some are pretty bad, but I think that they are worth keeping because they are part of the past. They're worth keeping for two reasons. One, they commemorate a real historic event, and two, we can learn a great deal about the people at that time by seeing what was important to them and how they interpreted that event. We had a seminar room at UNC Charlotte, and there's a picture of a nurse sitting by the bed of a young soldier who's seriously wounded. And in this sort of gauzy background is a Confederate battle flag. And there was great controversy, should we move it, should we not move it? But it's a great teaching tool because it says something about, and we talked earlier about the fact that most of the soldiers died not on the battlefield, but it also reflects a particular interpretation, a particular time. And I think as a teaching tool, placing it in its appropriate context, I think that's a good thing. Sir?
Do you think that the romanticization of the South by the North kind of gave license to the South to not have so much shame about what the slavery and Confederacy?
Well, that's an interesting question because the white Southerners were at first amused by this depiction of them. I remember my father telling me when he came down from Michigan to Memphis. He was on a train, and he kept looking around, wondering where Tara was, wondering where all those beautiful plantations and women in hoop skirts and stuff like that. So you get these images embedded in your mind that you think are that are embedded in the northern mind. That many Southerners realize that, okay, well, if you want us to dress up in hoop skirts and suits, we'll do that for you. But for most Southerners, they recognized that this was really a show, but this was a show to their advantage because it allowed them to deal with their own racial issues all by themselves until African Americans began knocking at the door and saying, you can't continue to do this. And at the same time, Northerners were dealing with their own issues. And they made this connection between immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and African Americans. And they believed that both were unfit for democracy. So if you want to disfranchise black people, well, go ahead. I wish I could do that in the North. We wish we can do that in the North. If you want to separate them in schools, in separate schools, yeah, okay, we understand that, do that as well. We're trying to do that too. I was living in Brooklyn when I went to high school, and our high school had 2,000 students, 2 of whom were African Americans. See, the Brown decision did not apply to northern schools. This race in America is an American, as the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal wrote in The American Dilemma, is an American problem. It's not a Southern problem. It's an American problem. And for decades, Northerners used the South as an excuse. Hey, we don't have a racial problem. Look at the South. It's just that's one of the fictions that I think is beginning to dissipate.
I have a two-part question.
Right.
One, you know where Governor Aycock did like?
Do you know where Governor Aycock's statue is? It's taken out south of Hill, in place of Statue of Liberty. And the second part is, do you feel that is it justifiable to penalize these gentlemen in history who stood
That's a wonderful question. Here's what I tell my students. Do not impose your 21st century values on people who lived in the, say, the 19th century. In the 1970s, there was a flurry of books and articles on Abraham Lincoln as a racist. That is, Abraham Lincoln believed in white supremacy. Well, so what? 98% of white Americans believed in white supremacy in the 1850s. How does this diminish Abraham Lincoln? Because he just accepted the prevailing wisdom. But he fought against it. But he grew as a person. And I think that's really the important thing to keep in mind. Now, as far as ACOC is concerned, you can argue certainly that he did a great deal for education, for example, in North Carolina. And all this about renaming buildings and removing statues, I think it's a little bit much. There was a controversy in New Orleans not too long ago where they had George Washington Middle School, and they wanted to rename it. Why? Because George Washington was a slaveholder. Yeah, okay, so anybody in this audience this morning who is perfect, stand up. We all have faults, right? And it's to George Washington's credit that he liberated his slaves. So to impose our enlightened views on people who could not benefit from that enlightenment is difficult. You go to Charleston, South Carolina, right at the square there, Francis Marion Hotel. There's a big statue of John C. Calhoun, and right next to it is the Holocaust Memorial. Well, how could you have a Holocaust Memorial and John C. Calhoun? Well, it's part of history. It's part of our history. And instead of trying to bury it, the best thing to do is to understand it. Now, it may be we'll continue to have different views and different interpretations on it. That's fine, at least as we understand each other's point of view. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll get to you.
Hi. Growing up in Virginia, I've always seen the Confederate flag as a symbol of racism, hatred, and white supremacy. But I hear people defending it and saying it's divorced from that. You said you might talk about the different perspectives of the flag. Can you talk a little bit?
Sure. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Confederate government had to do a lot of things because they were a new country and everything from a currency to establishing foreign relations. And one of the things they had to do was to design a battle flag. The first battle flag had the St. Andrew's cross in the corner, and the rest of it was white. It was called the Stainless Banner. But as you probably know, going onto a battlefield with a white flag is probably not the best idea. So they redesigned it. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the debates in the Confederate Congress over the design of the first Confederate battle flag, they wanted to make certain that they said that the white represented white supremacy, that it represented the supremacy of the white race. They made no bones about it. In fact, all this business about, the Civil War was about states' rights, the Civil War was about tariffs, the Civil War was about Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War was about slavery. Yeah, states' rights, certainly. The right of states to carry slaves to the territory, the right of states to keep slaves where they are. But it was about slavery. And there's no doubt that for many of the people in the Confederate Congress, that was the case. It was only after the Civil War, when slavery became so reviled, that the causes of the Civil War became renewed. Now, in the 1890s, several states in the South, most southern states, imposed disfranchisement on African Americans. Lynching increased, and also racial segregation by law. And the idea was that, hey, you know, the blacks are getting uppity. They think they're just as good as we are. The black middle class is growing. So let's put them in their place. And what happened was that several states redesigned their state flags to mimic the Confederate battle flag. Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. You look at those state flags, and they're basically the Confederate battle flag. And the Florida and Alabama flags have this white background on them. And again, the legislatures of these states emphasized the white supremacy. Georgia redesigned its flag to mimic the Confederate battle flag in 1956. Why 1956? Because it was the start of the civil rights movement. So again, the connection between the battle flag and discrimination. Is it heritage or hate? Well, if you listen to the words of white Southerners who designed these flags at the particular times they designed them, it was definitely hate. But, there's always a but in history, but I can understand that people whose ancestors fought for the Confederacy to protect their homes, to protect their families, who didn't even own slaves, I could see where that would represent part of their heritage. For this reason, regardless of what bad guys used the Confederate battle flag, the Confederate battle flag deserves to be displayed, but in a museum. In a museum, in its proper historical context. And there's a personal thing as well. The Bible says, love thy neighbor as thyself. And if one of your neighbors is African American and you choose to fly the Confederate battle flag, you're not loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Even if it's a matter of heritage to you, to your neighbor it's a symbol of hate, and therefore it should come down. Yeah.
I had a comment and a question. The comment was about the South Carolina legislative building and the flag being flown over it. It's actually interesting, if you go there, you can see there's complication of this kind of memorializing. There is that thing for the Confederacy. There's also a slave memorial right in France, and there's a statue of Strom Thurmond with the names of his children inscribed underneath. And added to it, you can see it's in a different hand. Was this child that was by a black woman?
Right. I think that's a good way to approach it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. Nikki Haley, when she was governor of South Carolina, and she ordered the flag to come down. Ultimately, this is not a moral decision. This is a business decision, because you don't want boycotts and you don't want to lose investment. But that's okay, because the result is still the same. Yeah, go ahead.
The question was, you focused on sort of pop culture and movies and how that transformed this view of the South. Can you say a word about the role of academic historians?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned popular culture because most people are affected by that. Nobody reads academic historians, except maybe from my books. Yeah, up until the 1950s, 1960s, the prevailing view of the Civil War and Reconstruction was the same that I showed you from Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind. In fact, Margaret Mitchell, when she researched the book, Gone with the Wind, which made into a movie, when she researched the book, she scoured historians. She read U.B. Phillips, for example. She read Douglas Southall Freeman, the biographer of Robert E. Lee. So she did her research, no question about that. And she set about to write a story not celebrating white supremacy, but to tell the story of the war, and particularly how the war affected women. That was her effort in Gone with the Wind. And of course, Scarlett O'Hara is a prototypical feminist in many respects. And Margaret Mitchell endowed a scholarship at the Spelman, which is a historically black college in Atlanta. So she was not what you think the author of Gone with the Wind was. But that was what historians were writing. But in the 1950s, C. Vann Woodward, a strange career of Jim Crow, was a path-breaking book because C. Vann Woodward was a white historian from Arkansas. And historians began to look into African American history, not necessarily from a white perspective, but from the perspective of the sources. The sources had been there all along, and these interpretations began to change, and in the 1950s and 1960s. And of course, African Americans had a great deal to do with the change in interpretation because suddenly they were no longer victims. They were no longer victims, but they were agents of their own liberation as a result of the civil rights movement. So historians went back, well, how could this be? There must be a backstory. And of course, the backstory stretched all the way back to the end of the Civil War. And now that's the prevailing interpretation. Now, in my book, America Flame, I try to complicate the story a little bit because as part of that change in interpretation, as I said, most historians view the Civil War as the Republic of Virtue, the North, against the evil empire, the South. And my take on it is they're both to blame for the war and its aftermath, and that the war should never have happened to begin with. Any other questions?
I'm not sure how to phrase the question, so I'm going to work my way into it. I'm from the north, so I might have a blind spot in this particular area, but you mentioned
You probably do.
98% of folks from that time held a particular road point of view towards slavery, things like that. What about the 2%? Are there any leaders that should have plaques or statues or museums dedicated to them from the South specifically, even the Deep South specifically, that are forgotten?
I don't know if they're forgotten, but the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke from South Carolina, for example, who were abolitionists and believed in racial equality. I think certainly they're worthy of commemoration as well. And I know there was a symposium in Columbia, University of South Carolina, in Columbia, that honored the Grimke sisters. So that is that is going on, and they were part of that small 2%. But keep in mind that in the north, and of course the Grimke sisters had to flee to the north because they were not too popular in South Carolina. In the north, the abolitionists were reviled. They were mobbed. A few were killed, and their publications were destroyed. They were not very popular in the north. So to say that Abraham Lincoln was a racist or that this person was a racist, this doesn't advance the argument any, because you have to consider the context of the time, and you also have to consider the context of the man and what other things he did to lighten the burden of racism.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the laws that were created during the Reconstruction movement to basically take ex-slaves and turn them into free prison labor?
Yeah. There were various means to do this. And you're probably talking about the sharecropping system. What happened was that obviously white landowners could not re-enslave black. That would not go. First of all, there was an amendment, the 13th Amendment. That would not work. The second problem was that the Southern economy was just in shreds after the Civil War. It took the South until 1920 to reach the per capita income they had in 1860. And in the meantime, the rest of the country had advanced quite far by 1920. So it was a long, long process. And the slave labor was central to the Southern economy. And black labor became even more essential after the war because the only currency in the South, and the banks were gone, the currency was useless, but the only currency, real currency in the South was cotton. And cotton is very labor intensive. It was not until the 1960s that you had a functioning cotton picking machine. So it was not something, oh, well, we'll just get a machine and we don't need the labor. It was very labor intensive. So you had to find the means, a deal between the former slaves and the former masters. And the deal sounded pretty good in the abstract. Here's the deal. You, landowner says to the black sharecropper, you farm this area of the plantation, and when it's time to harvest, we'll give you 1/3 or 1/2 of the profits. And that's the way both of us will make money. And that was a pretty good deal. The problem is that cotton plunged from 40 cents a pound to 5 cents a pound by the late 1880s, early 1890s. So what you're doing is that you're really cutting your profit margin significantly. And when you add to that these lands had to be heavily fertilized because cotton leaches the soil. This is one of the arguments why slavery needed to expand, because cotton is so damaging on the nutrients of the soil. So you had to fertilize it very, very heavily, and fertilizer costs money, costs lots of money. So the profit margins were very, very thin. And what happened was a lot of the plantation owners, what they did was set up stores on their plantations because they didn't want the workers to go running off to town, and God knows if they ever come back again. So they can shop for clothing, they can shop for food, they can shop for gifts, anything imaginable. It would just be like a general store. And the store owner would keep the ledger. And October came, and you sell your cotton, and you get your return, and you see what you made. Then you go to the store to get paid. And the store will say, well, you spent this much on whatever items you purchased during the year, and you got this return from the cotton. And there was a lot of fraud involved as well, because most sharecroppers could not read or write. Who could read a ledger? But even if the guy was honest, the landowner was honest, it frequently happened because the South used to be a net exporter of food. After the war, they became a net importer, so it was more expensive. So food was more expensive, cotton was much less expensive, so the prices in the general store were relatively high compared to what they would be in other parts of the country. And you were in debt. It's called debt peonage, which means that, hey, next year you got to work off this debt. You got to work the land. So basically, it's a form of slavery because you're working to pay off a past debt that you never can work off. Well, you say, well, why didn't the guy just take his family and move to another plantation? Well, that guy, the plantation owners are going to ask, well, what are your references? Where did you work last? So that wouldn't work. And so by the early part of the 20th century, African Americans had had enough. They did one of two things. They moved to the cities, Atlanta, Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, or they joined the Great Migration northward. That was the only way to escape debt peonage. Sorry for the long answer.
Any other questions? I have one quick question. You had kind of gave the examples of Washington and Lincoln. Looking at this whole issue comparatively, other countries like South Africa have had reconciliation commissions or kind of an acknowledgement of something wrong has happened. I don't think anything of that nature has ever happened in the United States